She walked into the federal courthouse on Van Buren Street carrying nothing but a leather binder, a dress uniform pressed with surgical precision, and the kind of calm that comes from knowing you are about to destroy everything someone has built. Her father sat 50 feet away in the mahogany-paneled courtroom, surrounded by 3 attorneys in suits that cost more than her annual military salary, flanked by his second wife in designer sunglasses, absolutely convinced his daughter had finally come to surrender. He had no idea what was actually about to happen. Her name is Meredith Chen, and this is the story of the moment she walked into a room, appearing to be completely outmatched, and walked out having exposed federal crimes that would reshape her family's entire future. But here's what makes this story matter to you and me. It's not really about courtroom drama. It's about the moment when someone you trusted completely underestimates you so profoundly that they make an irreversible mistake. It's about what happens when you stop performing weakness and show your true strength. Meredith was 29 years old when she stepped into Department 12C of the United States District Court in downtown Chicago, the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows and casting everything in that harsh institutional brightness that makes everyone look guilty. She was a captain in the Army, with 6 years of active duty in logistics and strategic operations, deployed twice to active theaters. 6 years of discipline, strategy, and learning to recognize threats from 1,000 miles away. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, was a commercial real estate developer who had built his empire by understanding one simple principle: find what people valued most, then make them choose between keeping it and survival. When their mother, Eleanor Chen, died from cancer during Meredith's senior year of high school, Thomas didn't mourn. He restructured. Within 6 months, his second wife Victoria had moved into the family's North Shore estate, had demanded the modernization of everything Eleanor had carefully preserved, and had made it abundantly clear that Meredith's life had a price attached to it. If she wanted to stay in that house, she would need to abandon her dreams of military service. She would need to work in one of Thomas's development companies. She would need to understand that loyalty meant compliance. Everything had a cost. Meredith looked her father in the eye and walked towards something he couldn't understand, a path he couldn't control. She joined the Army. She earned her commission as an officer. She deployed overseas, leading operations in high-stress zones, and for the first time in her adult life, she answered to laws and commanders, not to the whims of a parent who viewed relationships as property. She was free. Or so she thought. What Meredith didn't know, what she couldn't have known, is that her absence gave her father permission to execute the plan he'd been secretly developing for years. Eleanor's will had established an irrevocable trust. The trust owned the North Shore estate, 115 acres of historically significant property that Eleanor's own parents had deeded to her with strict instructions: never develop it commercially, maintain the gardens, fund the charitable foundation that bore Eleanor's name. It was legacy. It was sacred. To Thomas, it was $47 million in prime real estate opportunity that he couldn't access while his daughter remained alive to inherit it. So he began to disassemble it piece by piece. He created shell companies registered through his attorney in the Cayman Islands. He diverted commercial revenue from Eleanor's charitable foundation money meant for arts education and environmental conservation and routed it into his failing residential development projects. He fabricated notary stamps. He forged Meredith's signature on documents he claimed granted him fiduciary authority during her deployment. He filed paperwork declaring her legally absent, abandoning her parental responsibilities, unfit to inherit. He was methodical. He was certain that a deployed soldier halfway around the world would never notice. He didn't count on the fact that military service doesn't make you blind to corruption. It teaches you to recognize an ambush from miles away. When Meredith's plane touched down at O'Hare after a 10-month deployment, she rented a car and drove north on the Edens Expressway toward the North Shore, toward the place where her mother had planted rose gardens and hosted scholarship ceremonies and built something that would outlast all of them. She wasn't expecting a reunion party. She wasn't expecting her father to have aged or learned kindness or reconsidered his transactions. But she also wasn't expecting to see bright orange eviction notices nailed to the gates of her mother's estate, marked with official court seals, declaring the property abandoned for commercial liquidation. She pulled over on the shoulder, gripped the steering wheel, and something crystallized inside her. He'd gone too far. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was about destroying her mother's memory. She felt it then, The cold clarity of someone preparing for war. The private dining club downtown where Thomas summoned her 3 days later was exactly the kind of place he would choose for this conversation. Soft lighting. Waitstaff trained to be invisible. A table positioned so he could see the entire room while maintaining privacy. He was already seated when she arrived, swirling a glass of burgundy that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Victoria sat beside him, adjusting a diamond bracelet that Meredith recognized immediately. Her mother's bracelet, the one Eleanor had worn on the day they took her to surgery. Seeing it on Victoria's wrist was like watching someone wear another person's skin. Thomas didn't look Meredith in the eye. He slid a certified bank check across the white linen tablecloth, and Meredith noticed his hand was trembling slightly. It was for $5,000. He had rehearsed this moment. She could see it in his careful language, in the way he swallowed before speaking. He called it a generous gesture. He called it a fresh start. He called it more than she deserved. Victoria laughed behind her wineglass, and Thomas used that as permission to continue. He explained, with the patience of someone speaking to a child, that Meredith lacked the background, the network, the capital, or the legal standing to contest his restructuring of the trust. Military service, he said, was a noble calling, but it had left her financially naive. She should take the money. She should sign the quitclaim deed that Victoria was already sliding across to her. She should walk away quietly and accept that this was how things worked in the real world. He was looking right at her, but he wasn't seeing her, and that was the moment Meredith understood the magnitude of his mistake. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. Crying would have been releasing the pressure, and she needed to maintain the pressure. She picked up the check and looked at it, really looked at it, committing every detail to memory, then set it down on the table with deliberate care. She stood up. She put on her uniform cap. She walked out into the Chicago rain without saying a single word. Thomas had always believed that silence meant compliance. He had no framework for understanding it as refusal, for understanding it as the sound of someone walking towards something he couldn't stop. What he didn't know is that Meredith had spent the last 4 months doing something that would reshape everything that was about to happen in that courtroom. She had filed federal complaints through her office in the Department of Defense. She had contacted the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. She had submitted subpoenas for every financial record connected to Eleanor's trust. She had assembled a certified forensic audit that traced, with absolute clarity, exactly where her mother's money had gone. She had documented every forged signature. She had built a case that wasn't just legally airtight, it was a federal indictment waiting to happen. Now she was walking into Department 12C, and everyone in that room except one person thought they knew exactly how this would end. The courtroom itself seemed designed to intimidate. The judge's bench was elevated. The wood was dark. The fluorescent lights made everything look sterile and permanent. Meredith's father sat at the plaintiff's table with his legal team, Marcus Belmont, the lead attorney, who was known for demolishing unrepresented parties with theatrical precision, and 2 junior associates who looked nervous but complicit. Marcus had already submitted 47 pages of documentation to the court registry. He'd done his homework. He'd done it badly, but thoroughly. Judge Patricia Russo was a woman in her mid-60s who had been presiding over probate and corporate law cases for 28 years. She was the kind of judge who had seen every trick, every manipulation, every attempted deception that wealthy people could muster. She looked at Meredith over her reading glasses with an expression of weary caution, already preparing herself for what she assumed would be a dismissal motion from Marcus. Marcus stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who had never lost. He wore his authority like cologne. He gestured toward Meredith with careful condescension, noting for the record that the respondent had arrived without legal representation, suggesting she clearly failed to understand the financial complexity of these proceedings. He dropped a thick stack of glossy financial statements onto the court reporter's desk with theatrical emphasis, watching to see if Meredith flinched. She didn't. She was watching his hands, his eyes, the way he breathed. She was studying him the way you study a military target. She was already 3 moves ahead. Marcus turned slightly to deliver his closing argument, the one he thought would seal everything. He said that Thomas had assumed fiduciary control to salvage the trust from insolvency. He said that Meredith's objections were purely sentimental and legally groundless. He said they requested immediate summary judgment and dismissal with prejudice. He smiled. He actually smiled, thinking he had won. Judge Russo looked down from her bench directly at Meredith. Her voice was measured, professional, and carried the weight of someone offering a final warning. Captain Madden, she said the name. Acknowledging the uniform with a small nod, civilian probate and corporate property statutes are extraordinarily complex. The petitioner has submitted extensive documentation prepared by senior counsel. Do you fully understand that proceeding pro se, without licensed representation, exposes you to severe financial sanctions, attorney fees, and potential permanent loss of all claim to this estate? It was a moment of mercy. The judge was giving her an exit ramp. She was offering one last chance to admit that she was outmatched. Meredith stood up from behind the defense table. She was in uniform, which meant she was representing not just herself, but something larger than herself, an institution, a code, a commitment to truth that transcended her personal situation. She straightened the creases of her jacket. She walked to the center lectern with a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant. It was the walk of someone who had trained for exactly this moment. The courtroom fell into that particular kind of silence that happens when an entire room is holding its breath. Her father's expression had shifted. He was no longer smiling. He was watching her with the beginning of something that looked like concern, the way someone watches a situation they thought they controlled start to slip. Meredith placed her leather binder on the lectern. She opened it with deliberate care, not frantically, not desperately, but like someone who knew exactly what was inside, and why it mattered. She looked directly at Judge Russo, then slowly turned her gaze to her father. "Your Honor," she began, and her voice was steady, clear, and resonating with something deeper than fear. "I am not proceeding out of ignorance, and I am not outmatched. I do not require civilian counsel today, because I am a Judge Advocate General Corps officer and a certified federal investigator for the United States Department of Defense." The words landed in the courtroom like a detonation. Meredith watched her father's face in real time. She watched the color drain from his skin. She watched his hand, which had been resting on the mahogany table with relaxed confidence, suddenly grip the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. She watched his mouth open slightly, then close. She watched Victoria's jaw drop open in stunned disbelief, the designer sunglasses sliding down her nose as she turned to stare at Thomas with the expression of someone suddenly understanding they had miscalculated catastrophically. Marcus Belmont looked like someone had reached into his chest and removed his certainty without warning. His confident posture collapsed. His eyes darted frantically between Meredith and the insignia on her chest, the crossed sword and pen of the U.S. Army JAG Corps, positioned directly above her service ribbons. He was doing the math in his head, Meredith realized. He was understanding, in real time, that he had been playing a game with someone who was operating under a completely different set of rules. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Meredith continued, and her voice never wavered, never cracked, never signaled anything but absolute certainty, while Miss Belmont was presenting his opening remarks. "My office filed certified federal evidentiary binders directly to this court's registry. We have been submitting documentation for the past 6 months, operating under full federal authority and the protection protocols established by the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Every violation against my person while actively deployed constitutes federal violation. I have conducted a joint forensic audit alongside the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I can feel the shift in the room. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was real. This was federal." Judge Russo leaned forward. Her entire demeanor had transformed from cautious to acutely engaged. She was opening the electronic registry on her bench monitor, and Meredith watched her expression change as the stamped federal seals came flooding across the screen. Meredith could see it in the judge's eyes. She hadn't known. The federal filings had come through proper channels, but she was seeing them in real time, and they were extensive. They were detailed. They were backed by federal authority that transcended anything happening in this particular courtroom. "Exhibit Alpha," Meredith said, opening the first section of her binder, "contains forensic banking records, tracing $32.7 million, systematically drained from my late mother's irrevocable trust across an 18-month period." She placed the documents on the bench for Judge Russo to review. These funds were routed through 3 offshore shell entities registered in the Cayman Islands, all directly controlled by the plaintiff as sole beneficial owner. Every transaction is documented. Every signature is cross-referenced. Every routing number is traced. Thomas's hands began to shake. Not trembling anymore, but actively shaking. Meredith could see beads of sweat forming on his temples. She watched the moment the reality of what was happening struck him. This wasn't about losing the court case anymore. This was about criminal exposure. This was about the possibility of federal indictment. This was about the fact that every choice he had made, every shortcut he had taken, every document he had forged, had been catalogued and was now being presented to a federal judge in real time. Exhibit Bravo, Meredith continued, details 6 separate quitclaim deeds and corporate restructuring documents bearing signatures that were represented as mine. She turned to place these documents on the bench as well. Federal forensic document examiners have confirmed through sworn affidavit that every single signature was forged. These documents were executed while I was 4,000 miles away in an active theater of operations, unable to refute them, unable to defend against them, unable to even know they were being prepared. This constitutes aggravated identity theft. This constitutes wire fraud. This constitutes deliberate violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which explicitly protects active duty personnel from property seizures and civil actions executed without judicial review and explicit notification. Judge Russo's expression had hardened into something approaching fury. She was studying Thomas now, and Meredith could see the judge making internal calculations about credibility, about culpability, about the magnitude of what had actually occurred in her courtroom. Marcus Belmont was whisper-shouting with his junior associates, frantically shuffling through papers, as if he might find some legal maneuver that could undo what was unfolding. There was no maneuver. There was no escape. There was only the inexorable march of evidence and federal authority. Exhibit Charlie, Meredith said, placing the final section on the bench, documents the falsified notary stamps used to authenticate the forged signatures. The notary public in question confirmed under federal deposition that she never witnessed these signings, never authenticated these documents, and was unaware that her credentials had been used fraudulently. Her testimony is attached. The seal is real. The documents are not. The courtroom had moved beyond shock into something else entirely. Meredith could feel it in the air, the sense that everyone in this room was witnessing a moment that would change the trajectory of multiple lives. She could see her father's junior associates looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from him legally. She could see Victoria checking her phone, probably calling her own attorney, probably protecting her own interests. She could see Judge Russo preparing to make a decision that would reshape everything. What I want the audience to understand right now, and what I wish someone had told my own family years ago, is this. When you build power on lies and theft, you are not actually building power. You are constructing a house of cards and convincing yourself that no wind could possibly topple it. You are so focused on everyone else's perceived weakness that you never develop the instinct to recognize your own vulnerability. Meredith's father had spent 6 years watching his daughter from a distance and seeing only military discipline and financial limitation. He had never considered that military service might have trained her in something more valuable than any amount of wealth. The discipline to recognize a threat, prepare an appropriate response, and execute it with precision. That's what separates people who merely react from people who strategically think several moves ahead. Your Honor, Meredith said. And this was the moment where the legal argument shifted into something more profound. Under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, any default judgment, property alienation, or civil restructuring, executed against an active duty service member, without explicit judicial review and proper notification, constitutes severe, willful federal misconduct. My father did not attempt to preserve my mother's legacy. He attempted to steal it while I was unable to defend it. He used forged documents, fraudulent notaries, and offshore accounts to conceal the theft. This is not a civil matter. This is a criminal matter. Judge Russo set down her reading glasses. She looked at Marcus Belmont with an expression of such controlled fury that he actually took a physical step backward. She looked at Thomas Hartwell, and something in her gaze suggested that she was done with the pretense of neutrality. Mr. Belmont, she said, her voice dropping into dangerous gravel. Are you aware that the federal documentation currently in my registry predates any motion you filed in this courtroom? Are you aware that federal investigators have had your client's financial records for 6 months? Are you aware that you have just attempted to secure summary judgment in a case that should have been referred to the United States Attorney's Office before it ever entered this courtroom? Marcus had nothing to say. There was nothing to say. The entire foundation of his case, the entire structure of confidence he had built, had been demolished with the precision of controlled demolition, carefully planned, perfectly executed, and leaving nothing standing but rubble. I want you to really sit with this for a moment, because I think this is where the real lesson of this story lives. Meredith walked into this courtroom alone. To everyone watching, to the judge, to the opposing counsel, to her own father, she appeared to be completely vulnerable. She had no attorney to negotiate on her behalf. She had no expensive legal team. She was wearing a military uniform, which to people who measure worth by wealth markers, signals limitation rather than authority. And yet, the entire time that everyone was measuring her by what she was lacking, she was accumulating something they couldn't see. The kind of authority that comes from being right, from having evidence, from knowing that the law itself was on her side. That's a different kind of power than money. It's slower to develop, but it's the kind that actually lasts. Judge Russo brought her gavel down with a single resounding crack that seemed to echo through the entire building. The petitioner's motions are denied with extreme prejudice, she announced. All disputed estate titles are remanded immediately to Captain Meredith Chen. All frozen trust assets are restored to the original fiduciary structure. This court is formally issuing a criminal referral to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and I am notifying the FBI, the SEC, and the Department of Homeland Security of the federal crimes documented in these proceedings. Thomas collapsed backward into his leather chair. He was no longer the confident real estate developer who had walked into this courtroom expecting victory. He was a broken man watching his entire world disintegrate in the span of 10 minutes. His attorneys were packing their materials with the speed of people abandoning a sinking ship. Victoria had already stood up and was walking toward the door, disconnecting herself from the wreckage before anyone could associate her with what was about to unfold. As Meredith walked out of the courtroom into the marble rotunda, where sunlight was streaming through the tall windows, creating that golden hour glow that makes everything look like it's been washed clean, she heard footsteps behind her. Frantic footsteps. Desperate footsteps. Thomas had followed her out, and he was calling her name in a voice she barely recognized. Fractured, pleading, unraveling. Sophie, please. You're my daughter. We can fix this as a family. We can work this out. She stopped walking. She turned around. She looked at her father, really looked at him, and she saw a man who had built his entire life on the premise that everything was negotiable. Everything was for sale. Everything could be fixed with money and manipulation. And she realized something that she wanted to tell everyone watching this video. Sometimes people don't deserve second chances. Sometimes the only justice you can offer is the truth. You stopped being my father the day you tried to steal my mother's legacy, Meredith said, and her voice was not angry. It was something more final than anger. It was clarity. Now you face the consequences of that choice. She walked away without looking back. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't allow herself even a moment of satisfaction. She simply walked, and the marble rotunda seemed to hold her up, and the sun seemed to light the way forward. Here's what I want every person watching this to understand. Meredith's victory wasn't actually about the courtroom. It wasn't about the money, even though $47 million was restored to her mother's legacy, even though the charitable foundation was fully funded again, even though the estate was protected. The real victory was something far more valuable. It was the moment she stopped performing weakness and revealed her true capability. It was the moment she understood that the people who underestimate you most are often the people who taught you how to see through deception. It was the moment she chose justice over reconciliation. This story taught me something that I think every person watching needs to know. The mistake most people make is believing that if someone underestimates them, that means they should spend their life proving themselves to that person. The actual lesson is different. The actual lesson is that the people worth convincing are never the people who had to be forced into seeing your value. They're the people who saw it from the beginning, and the moment you stop performing for the people who require proof is the moment you become truly free. Here's the action I want you to take today. I want you to think about a situation where you have been underestimated, where someone, maybe a family member, maybe an authority figure, maybe a boss, has looked right through you and made assumptions about your capability or your strength. I want you to sit with that for just a moment, and then I want you to ask yourself this. What strength do I have that they're not seeing? What evidence do I have that contradicts their assumption? And most importantly, do I actually need them to see it in order for it to be real? Because the answer to that last question is probably no. Now I want to know what you think about the way Meredith handled this situation. In the comments below, I want you to tell me, did you think she made the right choice refusing to reconcile with her father? Was she right to pursue criminal charges? Or should she have settled for just recovering the estate? Or do you think she should have pushed even harder? Comment 1 if you think she handled it perfectly. Comment 2 if you think she was too harsh. Or comment 3 if you think she didn't go far enough. I'm genuinely curious where you land on this. Also, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. And finally, have you ever experienced a situation where you walked into a room expecting to lose, but you actually had all the ammunition you needed? I want to hear those stories. I want to know if this resonated with something in your own life. If stories like this matter to you, stories about people finding quiet strength, about justice being served, about the moment when everyone finally sees what was always there, please hit that subscribe button. I post videos like this every single week, and I promise you that every story I tell is worth the time you invest in watching. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you next time. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Chicago to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.